Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Space launches have become very common. In fact, multiple times a week is now the norm. Each launch takes a well-choreographed set of operations to get payload to space. But what goes on behind the scenes to make that happen? Epsilon3's mission is to modernize space missions and complex engineering business and testing workflows by building the industry standard of operational software. My guest on this edition of the Ex Terra Podcast is Laura Crabtree, CEO of Epsilon3. Laura, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tom.
Happy to do it. So let's start off just talking about Epsilon3, what it is that you do, and the customers that you're at liberty to divulge.
Sure. So we've got a whole host of our customers listed on our website, but let's just talk about what we do from the beginning. So from the beginning, we saw a big problem in how companies were organizing, executing, and managing their missions, either a launch or a satellite operation, or even an engine test on the ground. And I saw this firsthand when I was at both Northrop Grumman and at SpaceX, that both of these, at both of these companies, we had slowdowns, we had miscommunications, we had missteps, and I had built some types of internal software. And so I knew what it took to build internal software. And then when I left SpaceX, I actually learned that most people don't buy internal software or don't create internal software. They actually go out and buy it. But there was nothing off the shelf that really worked for really complex engineering processes like we had for launches or rendezvous or anything in the space business. And so I set out to sort of fix that process. What we did in the 60s and 70s, we had paper. Then we transitioned to Word documents, which was a huge change, right? Then we transitioned to Word documents that maybe were a little bit more complex with comments in them and such, but they weren't executable. They were mostly flat. And so these days, people are using Excel spreadsheets, Confluence pages to really write down what they need to do. So when it comes to a launch, you have to orchestrate 20 different people. Hopefully it's not actually 20, but hopefully it's more like 3 or 4. And those people might be in different places. Well, how do you coordinate ops from different places? Well, you have to have a good software package to do it, or you have to do it all manually with, walkie-talkies and cell phones. But if you do it with a walkie-talkie and a cell phone, it's not going to be recorded anywhere. So we wanted to have a record of everything that you did in a launch or a satellite operation. We wanted to have all of the people in one place, coordinating with one another and communicating with one another. And then we wanted to integrate data. So when it comes to telemetry from a launch vehicle, from an engine test on the ground, from a satellite flying overhead, you want to integrate the data with what you're actually doing, the decision-making process by which you send commands and decide what to do next. And then the last piece is none of these things are linear. So when it comes to other softwares that are out there, most of them are linear, or they have very simplistic decision trees that don't meet the process by which we execute operations today. So in a nutshell, that's not really a nutshell, that was a lot. That's what we do. We help people go on to the next generation, which is not just digitized tools, but efficient digitized tools to connect the whole team. And let's see, some of our customers, we have customers in the launch side of things. So Firefly would be a really good example of that. They've been very successful recently, and their team is amazing to work with. We are working with some lunar lander companies. So Astrobotic, and then Firefly also has a lunar lander, and then a couple others. And then we're working with some satellite manufacturers and satellite operators. And then outside of the space industry, even still, we're working with aviation companies, fusion companies, renewable energy, and then robotics. There's just a whole slew of things that are tangential to space that operate very similarly. So just to name a few, those are a few of the customers that we're working with.
So how did you get involved in the space industry? Give me a little bit more about your background.
So I knew that I wanted to be an astronaut from when I was about 8 years old. And my parents are both not in engineering at all. My dad's a lawyer and my mom's a nurse practitioner. So coming from a background of, I know that I don't want to be in medicine because I don't like blood. I like how things work. I like how things come together. I like the system and I like space. So it was a natural progression for me to get more interested in space, watch space launches, watch all the shuttle launches, learn about astronauts, learn about the stars, and just wonder about what could be. And I studied all engineering classes, like, all AP classes in high school, in mostly in science. I liked history too, but different. And then when it comes to university, I just wanted to do the hardest thing possible. I wanted a challenge. I wanted someone to give me a problem that I didn't know how to solve without somebody walking me through it the first time. And so that's how I got into basically astronautics. And there were not very many astronautics programs when I was in college, which, if you could believe, was only 23 years ago. But back in the day, back in early 2000s, there weren't a lot of space programs. So I found the closest thing to it, which was aerospace astronautics at USC. And since then, USC now has a space program. They have just a plain astronautics program. It's not tied to the aerospace and mechanical engineering department. But then at that time, they didn't. And so, there were handful of others. And when I left USC, I applied for the jobs that everybody applied for: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop, obviously the Skunk Works section, and looked at NASA as well. But it turns out that I didn't want to move to Houston for university, so I didn't move there for after. Right. And I was offered a job at Northrop Grumman, and I took it. So that was my foray into space. Was basically, I kind of always knew I wanted to do that.
You've had experience then in both, and this just occurs to me because you've had experience with some of those legacy aerospace companies.
Yeah.
And now you're working mostly with startups and smaller companies. Kind of compare and contrast between those two, and how different is it to be working now more, not only as an entrepreneur yourself, but working with smaller companies as opposed to being a cog in a big wheel?
It's really fun working with small companies. They make decisions so quickly. Mm-hmm. Things can change every day. Things can change every week. Things can change every month. I really love the fast-paced movement of the startup industry, but the fact of Epsilon3 is we work with larger companies too. We're working with multi-thousand person companies, and the difference is in the decision making. It's how many people need to be involved in the decisions. It's how fast people can make decisions. It's the amount of spend they may or may not be comfortable with. And so for a product like Epsilon3, we have to think about all of those factors and who we're marketing to and how we take our product to market. There's a lot of complexities in that. So I would say the legacy companies have a lot of really wonderful experience under their belts, and they can certainly teach the smaller companies some very valuable experiences there. And then the smaller companies, their ability to move fast and be agile is very, very important as well. And so I think they come together. The small companies teach the legacy companies something, and I think Epsilon3 is something where we take input and feedback from both small and large companies alike. So we're essentially trying to help both of them move faster at the same time.
I want to go back to your background just a little bit, because I like to talk with people about kind of what was their aha moment for getting into the space industry. And I always equate it back to my own, which was I was 10 years old. I was at summer camp. It was 1969 in July. Nothing of any import happened in July of 1969.
Yeah.
And we got to go up to the camp director's office quarters and watch the moon landing on a little 9-inch black and white TV. Yep. And that was kind of my aha moment. This is really cool, and I like to find a way to be involved. What was yours?
So I would say, since I already knew I wanted to be in the space industry, there was an aha moment when I was in school at USC. There was a disaster. There was a big failure. Columbia happened when I was a senior.
Mm-hmm.
And I had not thought about what job I would want yet. But when that happened, I knew at that moment when I was reading about it and saw it, that I had to be involved in the industry and I needed to make some impact. And I didn't want to ever see that happen again, obviously. But because I had already been working towards that, it was the I'm not turning back now moment, where, I'm all in. And I think after that, I applied to a bunch of jobs and realized that I was definitely in the space industry, because I hadn't applied to any jobs yet. This was, just before, well, actually it was my junior year, but yes.
So coming back to Epsilon3, obviously you can't do this by yourself. So tell us a little bit about your team.
So we have a great team. I love working with every member of the team. And I think that's one of the most important things to a startup is the team. And let's start with my co-founder, Max, who is the first person I met after I left SpaceX and started thinking about what I wanted to do. I had written down somewhat of a business plan, and clearly I'm an engineer. I didn't go to business school. I didn't know how to start a business. And a friend of mine had introduced me to Max, and we started talking, and I told him what problems I wanted to solve in the industry. And he said to me, which is something that other people have asked me, why can't I do this with Asana? And he loves Asana. And I said, well, here are all the reasons: complexities and conditional statements and telemetry and record keeping. And he said, oh yeah, I might be able to do 1/10 of that with Asana, but I'm not going to do the rest of it. And he said, this seems like a big problem. We should go out and solve it. And that was kind of history. We then started a couple months later. So officially started a couple months later after, looking for funding, but basically writing down a business plan and trying to get customers. And then we hired our first 2 engineers shortly thereafter. Their names are Deep and John, and they've been with us ever since. And basically, we find people that have experience that is not like our own. We look for people that may or may not have space experience, but the one thing that rings true for everybody is that they have a passion for what we do. They have a passion for our customers. So we have hired people from automotive. We have hired people from video photo editing. We've hired people from other places, like aircraft software, aircraft testing, that basically bring together all of the different backgrounds that we need to be successful here. And the thing that's really important to me is that everybody likes and supports one another. And so the engineering team is very close, and they talk daily all the time. We are a remote team, so that is very difficult, but that team is really strong and really skilled. Really proud of the team that we've put together. The team culture is one of the things that I'm most proud of. We do things to strengthen the team culture just because we know we're all remote, and it's really important. You
alluded to this just a bit, but I kind of want to get a little bit more in depth with it, because there's software for analytics, there's software for design and processes, documentation, yada, 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 but they don't really do what Epsilon3 does. So how can you tell me about the fundamental differences?
Yeah, so the biggest difference is we look at the problem from, what does the operator need to see? And the operator needs to see maybe what happened in the past. So when the spacecraft was being built, what happened? Who was doing things? What was it? What was the testing like? The operator needs to know what they need to do now, and they need to know what data is being collected. So how do you bring all those things together? There's obviously things that collect data, large data sets. There's obviously things that do some analysis, but that's not the most important thing for the operator. The operator is not going to go off and do analysis. They need information in front of them quickly most of the time.
Right.
So how do we give them that information quickly? Well, you want to string together what happened yesterday, what happened, 2 weeks ago with what's going to happen tomorrow. And if you have everything in one platform, you have the string to do that. We talk about an interconnected system. Most companies end up with 10 different softwares that do the things that we do. And I just feel that if you have 10 different softwares, there's going to be a break in the line somewhere. Someone's not going to have access to the right information that they need to at the time they need it. And I don't want that to happen.
I'm talking with Laura Crabtree, CEO of Epsilon3 on the Ex Terra Podcast. Take a moment right now to click on subscribe to be sure you don't miss any of our podcasts, or if you're watching on YouTube, any of the videos from Ex Terra, the Journal of Space Commerce. Laura, given that our systems continue to get more and more complex and more integrated with each other, your procedural approach seems quite robust. Why is that? Why is a procedural approach fundamental to this business?
So in the last 10 years, we've seen an increasing number of people go from company to company. And what you lack if you forget about something like Epsilon3 is you lack the ability to go from me to the next person when I leave. You have more internal information that leaves with every person that leaves. And if you make sure that everybody writes it down, you make sure that everybody tracks what they do, you do not lose any of that information. We call it tribal information in kind of a lot of the space industry or a lot of places I've worked. If you're lacking documentation, you're lacking a step-by-step approach to do things, you're going to have to reinvent the wheel. And reinventing the wheel is very costly, both in money and in time. And we want people to not have to do that.
Institutional knowledge, I've heard, is that being referred to.
That's a much better word for it.
Yes. I didn't coin it, so just take it and run. It's all good. But it's not just about the mission too. It's about the entire life cycle of a product or a program, right?
It is. It's more than just one procedure or 8 procedures. It's what do you need to do when you're building? Then when you test against those builds, how do you test against them and verify requirements? I'm not doing requirements, but you would verify them in another system. And then how do you then take that to operations after launch? How are you making decisions on what delta V you need to do, whether or not you need to, enable certain solar panels or turn off a battery or turn on a heater? How do you make those decisions? And then if a heater fails, how do you go back and see when it was installed on the vehicle, who installed it? Was this a problem with the lot number? Was this a problem with the install? And you'll have photographic evidence to be able to track all of those things as well.
So it sounds like you're really basically keeping track of the minutia in order to make the big project work.
It sounds pretty accurate, yeah.
I've made a career out of boiling things down into those kinds of sound bites.
Keep that one.
Please do. There does seem to be, though, a readjustment beginning in the industry, right? Now, as you know, it was in the last about 3 years, there was exponential growth. There were a lot of new companies that's starting to consolidate. Companies are starting to either pull back or in some cases even fail. It's all being tempered. And as I said, a couple of businesses going out of business.
Yep.
Some investor discontent seems to be out there as well with returns. And yet there are more projects than ever being started. What's your take on the space commerce industry over the last couple of years?
Well, let's start with 2021, which was a conundrum of a year for everybody. A lot of investors had money to invest because there were almost no investments. Well, not almost no, but there were very few investments in 2020. And investors had to relearn how to deploy capital because you had investors that took meetings on Zoom. You didn't have to see an investor in person. You could raise money over 20 different Zoom calls. And so there was a big shift you might not even meet the person you're investing in person until 6 months after you invested in them, which happened to a lot of people. And then 2022 happened and everything went downhill. The markets crashed, interest rates went up, and people started pulling back. But 2021 and early 2022 investments were at an all-time high. So you had a lot of companies that got started during that. A lot of people who may or may not have had experience starting companies, like myself included. And some of them have gotten acquired. Some of them went through a SPAC, and the SPACs recently have not done very well. And so investors see that and they think the market is waning. But I see a huge interest in the market. I see a lot of people very invested in what is to come. And I'm very invigorated by what's going on in the industry. I think if you have a 10 or 20 person company and maybe it's doing well, but it could merge with another company and have more capital and do even better, I see that as a win for everybody. So I think there might be more consolidation happening, but I don't see that as a failure of the industry. I see that as, the industry just recognizing where something might not be able to become a big business and merging with another business to become even bigger than the parts were from the beginning.
But when I talk to some of the money people for the podcast, and I've spoken with several fairly large investors, and one of the questions I always ask is, space is a long-term investment. It's almost always going to be multiple years between the germ of an idea and actually seeing something deployed. And I think there's a lot of kind of caution right now about putting your money someplace where you might not see a return on it for 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, sometimes it's more than that. So a couple of companies have actually launched their first missions in 2 to 2.5 years, which is amazing. And I'd love to see more people do that. But for some companies, it takes 5 years to get to their first mission. And if it takes 5 years to get to your first mission, you've already had to raise $50 or $100 million of capital to get there. And some investors just don't want to invest in long-term moonshot strategies. And there's a specific type of investor who is interested in hardware businesses, CapEx intensive businesses, and certain ones that are just focused on software. And I would say that the ones that are focused on national security, hardware, launch business, they are comfortable with returns not coming back for 10 plus years. And SaaS-focused investors, software-focused investors might want returns in 5 to 7 years. And so you have just a difference, and it just depends on the investor. And I think it will continue to pick up. It might be slower than 2021, but I think it's going to continue to pick up sort of mid-2024, I'm hoping.
And this also kind of goes back to the comparison between the large legacy companies and the smaller, more agile entrepreneurial companies, is that a company like Boeing can afford to take a 3 to 5 year pushback on a program. Gee, I wonder what that might be. whereas a smaller, more agile company doesn't have that luxury. They've got to get something to the market and try and make their money back.
Exactly. A small company, they usually get 18 to 24 months of runway with a raise. So let's say you raise $1 million, you have to make that last 18 to 24 months. I highly doubt that you can with a team, but let's say you want to try to do that. You've got to find a way to get money coming in rather than out before that time period is up. So you have to find a product that you can sell. Maybe it's not your end goal. So a lot of entrepreneurs are becoming more creative with how they think about monetizing their products, how they think about the go-to-market strategy. If you have a launch business, your launch might not be the first time you bring money in, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of different ways to go about that. And the government funding is one thing that people do. There's a lot of government funding out there, and there are small companies that are getting large government contracts, which is so great to see, because it's not always Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop, Raytheon getting all the government contracts anymore. Oh, SpaceX being the other one that gets all the contracts.
But what then is the kind of the impact of, because you mentioned government funding, the NASA SBIR program and some of those that are helping small companies out in getting their product going and making something out of it?
Yeah, so the SBIR program is very good for hardware companies. Mm-hmm. And it's very good if you can show progress on your tech and the government wants or needs it. It is not as good for software companies. The government doesn't really know how to buy software, especially recurring revenue software where you have to pay yearly. And so it's less fruitful for companies like ours. So what we do is we just look for people who need and want to use our software. And we utilize that as helping us do development.
We are just about out of time, Laura, but I ask this of all of our guests, and I want you to look at, if you might, over the next 10 to 15 years in space commerce and your role in it at Epsilon3, and tell me what you see. So let's see. Let's start with the space industry in general. I hate to make predictions, but in the next 10 to 15 years, I would love to see a private space station where you can run your own experiments. It is less firewalled off than the NASA experimentation. I think we need to learn how humans live and work in space more than just the heavily skilled astronaut crew, because there is a huge piece of our inherent being as humans and the need to explore. We want to know what's out there. And I think there are many keys to unlocking how we live on Earth in space. And we have yet to tap into that. I also feel like there's going to be a lot more data enabled from a lot of the Earth observation satellites. Sorry, my dog here, she's barking. She will not leave my side, so you get the dog. But okay. When it comes to crops, when it comes to migration, when it comes to temperatures and storms, we are just now hitting the surface of what's possible in the knowledge about our planet. And so I think Earth and the knowledge of what makes up the Earth, what makes us a great place to live, is only going to, be more strengthened by the knowledge we gain from space. So those are kind of the two things that I'd love to see. And the third thing is I'd love to see people land on the moon again, which goes along the lines of how do we live and work in space? If we can set up a moon base, which I don't know that that's going to happen in 10 to 15 years, but if we can set up a moon base, then we can set up a base anywhere. So I would love to see that. And I know that's really forward leaning, but there's I honestly don't think so. And I think it's going to be a private company. If it's not SpaceX, I think it's going to be a private company that does it before NASA does. Because again, as we've talked about, they're more agile, they can solve problems more quickly, and they don't have to worry about making sure that Congress gives them enough money to do the project.
It's true.
This makes a big difference. And so I think there's a really good possibility that it's going to be a private company that gets to the moon before NASA does. But I'm not in the prediction business either. Right. So I guess we'll see what happens.
And then the thing that I would love to see for Epsilon3 is all of the pieces that I just mentioned. I would love to see us as the infrastructure that helps support making those things possible. Our software living on a private space station, our software living on a moon base, our software living in the ground segment where the people are controlling the assets in space. Those are all of the ways in which I would like to continue contributing to this industry.
Laura, we are out of time, but I really appreciate you taking some time out to talk with us today. It's been a lot of fun, so thank you very much.
Yep, thank you.
Laura Crabtree is CEO of Epsilon3. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Ex Terra Podcast. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Audible, and many other popular podcasting platforms. Be sure to click on subscribe so you don't miss any episode of the podcast or any of our other videos. You can also get daily updates on space commerce by following the Journal of Space Commerce on Substack. And one thing more, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on X at XterraJSC. Until next time, I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for joining us.
I wanna go faster, faster. Hands in the air, we're gonna crash. Searching for the answers. My Galileo, the through is looking glass. Thirst for reason. Our dreamer's eyes we gaze into a sense of purpose, know my view. Like finding water on the moon.